So I kind of want, like, it sounds like a lot of you are preparing to write a short story for your chapter anthology with the theme of If Not Now, When? And so what I'm going to do is sort of do an abridged 2-hour version of the like 6 3-hour class that I teach at the University of Utah for their continuing education department. So apologies to Anna and Joanne and Gail, or did Gail leave? Okay. No, Gail, you're there. Because you've probably been through a lot of this, but we're going to tailor it and cruise through it tonight. There's going to be a lot of writing to do tonight. So it's very hands-on, and I'm going to invite you to do as much writing as you can, whether by hand or on the computer, and we're going to take breaks to give you time to write. The first thing that I think we should start with is from my lesson on generating ideas really quickly. And the exercise that I think is really fun that can generate a lot of ideas quickly, especially since I'm so bad at coming up with titles, is I try to come up with the title first. So what I want you to do is, and all of this is a lot easier too, when you already have in mind sort of maybe the idea the story wants to take or the theme, because the theme of the anthology is something that you have, and maybe that implies some stories. We're going to talk about theme a little later, and If Not Now, When isn't actually like a theme in the way we'll talk about it in short stories, but it is definitely a theme insofar as it's for the anthology. But to start, we're going to do a word association game. And what we're going to do is we're going to pick a word. And that word is going to be the word. You're going to do a lot of word associations. So we're going to start with a word that's a really active word. Common and undramatic words are bad. They don't work really well for this. You're going to want to use a word like blood or death or fear or witch or killer or thief, darkness, prisoner, sword, dragon, wizard, something that has dramatic potential. And if you guys want to shout a few out, we'll write a couple down, and we'll try to we'll start the exercise this way. Does anyone have a word like that? Something that might tie into some idea they have for your anthology story?
Murder.
Murder?
Unborn.
Anybody
Regret.
else?
Asylum.
Regret.
Regret. So I think as we'll go through this together as a group, I think murderer kind of has the most potential to do this easily. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a whole bunch of modifiers to it. So we're going to add adjectives to it and see what we can get. So shout out some adjectives like
unwilling.
Well, unwilling will come in later. What was another word you guys were shouting out?
Patient.
Forgetful.
Joyful.
Baffled.
Well, okay. Well, that's kind of another part. So one of the things later is to come up with things at odds with the word. Let's try some like prepositional phrases. So let's start with like
Murderer in the barn.
Murder underground.
Murder in the outhouse.
Ew.
Murderer in the bedroom.
Murderer in the library.
With a candlestick.
Murderer with the baby.
So let's try some, well, that kind of fits in a little later too. Let's try some verbs, like, anything along this,
Murderer researched.
Lies.
Plots.
Trapped.
Disguises.
huh?
Disguises.
So let's try adding another noun, something like,
Apocalypse.
and then this is where I usually ask you to start shouting out words that might be at odds with the word, right?
The reluctant murderer.
The gleeful murderer.
The trepidatious murderer.
The empathetic murderer.
The
And then-
regretful murderer.
And then try just kind of moving some of these around, like you know, switch the words around, see if you can come up with some mashups of these. Does that make sense? Like, anybody shout any of these out that you want to come up with something that like might be a cool title. Or don't, that's fine. So what I'm going to ask you to do is sort of take your idea for what you might want to use for your anthology story, and I want you to take about 5 minutes and do this word exercise. I think it works better by handwriting it, but if you want to use your computer, do that. But just kind of scratch out a whole bunch of ideas using that one core word that you think is going to tie into what you think your story might be for the anthology. Like, you know, Soft Came the Murderer sounds like a really good, cool title. Or, you know, you could change some of these too, like you get the, or, you know, whatever, I don't know. So, you know, if you wanted to take an asylum and put that there, or the unborn, or regret, or whatever word that it is that you've chosen that you want to try to explore here, take like 5 minutes and I'll time you. And do this word association game and see if you can come up with a title that you like in advance of writing the story. And it could generate a lot of ideas, because as you're looking at these, like, it really sort of is supposed to spark story ideas, right? The outhouse murderer implies a much different story than the Soft Came the Murderer, or murderous timidity is a different story than the gleeful murderer. Like, the gleeful murderer is almost like American Psycho, and murderous timidity is more like someone afraid to kill. You know what I mean? So it just sort of helps you make assumptions about what the story might be about. And you don't have to settle with one title. We're going to do a whole bunch of other exercises through the night to really help you come up with a more focused idea, but one of these might be a good thing to do. This is an exercise that I do a lot when I get stuck, and I need to write a short story on a deadline, and I might have maybe just the theme for the anthology or the call for entries or something. Or maybe I don't even have that. Maybe I'm just working on a short story because I need to write one, and I produce a short story every month no matter what. And I'll sit and do this exercise and see what stories get suggested to me, and always come up with something interesting and end up with a story. One of my favorite stories that has come out of this is I ended up with a really cool story called The Clockwork Dragon. That was a really cool story about, big surprise, a clockwork dragon. So I'll leave this up on the screen for about 5 minutes, and I want you to all take the time to try to come up with some titles. Mix and match words, add words that don't even seem like they belong there, and we'll come back at 7:35. Okay. Did anybody come up with any titles they thought were really good that they'd want to share?
I'll go ahead and throw one out. The Hand of the Brigand.
Okay. What sort of story does that imply to you?
For me, it's more of an adventure style story.
I'm like
Yeah.
fantasy. Like a medieval fantasy setting.
Anybody else get a title that they were taken with?
I've got one. Perfection Above the Skin.
What sort of story does that suggest to you?
I kind of have some rough themes for it, but basically regret in parenthood.
Okay. So does everybody sort of see where this could be a really powerful tool for you as you're trying to put together a short story? Maybe starting with the title, which, like I said, for me is always one of the hardest parts, could generate a lot of ideas just playing free word association games. Like, hopefully the intent is that you've got more ideas for stories than you did when you started. And then, so we're going to move on to the next part and keep track of those story ideas, or those title ideas, because you might end up wanting those. And we're going to move to characters, and I'm sort of wondering if we can have a brief discussion, and if a few of you want to just chime in, like, what are qualities you like reading about in characters? What is it that's going to draw you to a character as you're reading a story to hook you in?
I'm all about oppositions, like enemies to lovers, that kind of thing, or like tropes that are like a lot of the romance tropes that are like friends to lovers, enemies to lovers, like the kinds of relationships that exist within characters. That's kind of when a character becomes real to me, is once I don't figure out their name, etc., but figure out like who they actually are.
I have to be able to identify with them, and they have to feel real in whatever setting that they're in.
Yeah, I like it. Oh, sorry.
Oh, you go ahead.
I like it when they do like little humanizing things. Like, sure, they could be this badass supervillain that has like an army or whatever, but it's like, oh, I've run out of sugar for my tea. That's disappointing. Just, the little everyday things that make you identify with them no matter what side of the plot they're on.
Faults they have to overcome.
Yeah, I was going to say I like just absolute jerks. And I've been having a lot of fun writing them, and reading about them is very fun because I've just read a lot of characters who it's like they're so good and bad things kind of happen to them. And I think it's a lot more fun to read about somebody who's creating their own problems, and they kind of have to come to terms with that and what they have to do different.
I think that's one of my favorite things about Kvothe in Name of the Wind, is like he just makes all the worst decisions, and he's probably not even that good of a person. And he's probably a terribly unreliable narrator too. So one of the things that I think makes characters work, whether they're a jerk or whether they're a likable character or not, is the idea, Kurt Vonnegut in his rules for writing short stories, one of the rules that I think is one of the most important of them is every character should want something, even if it's just a glass of water. I'll put that up on the screen for you. So if your characters don't want anything, there's not going to be anything that they can there's nothing that the audience is going to root for them. And they all need to want something. One of my I did an interview with Rob Coleman, who's the he was the animation director for the Star Wars prequels. He was the first animation director that Industrial Light and Magic ever had. And I was asking him about some of the secrets that he got to give characters personality and how to bring them to life. And he said that one of the biggest things that he brought to his animators was to ask them what the characters were doing before, or what impacted them, right? Like, did they get a bad night of sleep and they're sort of grouchy about it? Did they stub their toe in the room on the way in? Did they have something stuck in their teeth? Any of these ideas to help add just that little bit of verisimilitude. But also you can use that in your short stories by saying, like, how does this impact what they want, even on just a minor scale? A short story that Vonnegut talks about in one of his books on writing, he said that just knocked him out. A student wrote a story where he doesn't even remember what the broader conflict of the short story was, but the character had something stuck in their teeth. And through all of the other travails that they were going through and the conversation they were having, their overriding goal was just to get that piece of whatever unstuck from their teeth. And he said that there wasn't a person who read that story that didn't have the visceral reaction to start tonguing at their teeth to try to get something that didn't exist out of them. And so that idea that a character wanting something, even just as simple as a glass of water, or that popcorn kernel unstuck from their teeth, can make any story sort of come to life. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some characters that you're going to use, the characters that you sort of want to maybe think about using in your short story. But you may not use them, and we can just use them for these exercises. I want you to imagine a character and their desire. What is it they want most? What is it they want most in the world? And what is it they want most in the short term? What is it they want most in just the scene, right? So I want you to take some time, like maybe like 6 or 7 minutes, and create 3 or 4 characters. And I want you to write 2 or 3 sentences describing them, and then 2 or 3 sentences about what they want. And if that feels too vague, here's some concrete things to give them. You can give them a name, a gender identity, age, profession, and a desire or a need. Make that desire or need something concrete, whether that's money or a career break or a specific personal achievement or the love of someone, something, and we'll do some things to flesh them out a little bit later, but just sort of, and we're going to see if what we can do about creating some conflicts for them. But I'll put some of this on the screen. So 2 or 3 sentences describing them, and then 2 or 3 sentences about what they want. And like I said, if that's too vague, go with that. Try to create at least 2 or 3 characters this way. Like I said, you might not use one of them, you might not use 2 of them, you might not use any of them in your short story for your anthology, but it will help you get through the rest of the exercises tonight. So we'll take till 7:50 on that. So hopefully you came up with at least a few characters that you'll be able to play with. And what we're going to do now is we're going to kind of do the same thing and add a little bit of complexity to one of these characters or a new character, preferably a villain, perhaps. But the idea that no character is a monolith, no person in general is all evil or all good. Characters that are all evil or all good or boring, and we don't really like reading about them or watching stories about them. And I think that giving villains really redeeming qualities makes them really interesting and complex, and I think giving heroes really abhorrent qualities makes them really interesting and complex. The best example of this that I can think of as a point counterpoint is Raiders of the Lost Ark. Indiana Jones, one of his major flaws, well, I mean, for one, aside from all the colonialist like artifact robbing, is the scene with Marion where he talks about how she calls him out as like, I was a child and you broke my heart. And he kind of throws back like you were old enough to know what you were doing, essentially. And that really makes casts a shadow on his character and his heroism. On the other token, you have Belloq, who describes himself in the film as a shadowy reflection of Indiana Jones. And Belloq is a French archaeologist working for the Nazis, which is pretty evil. But I think where it defies expectations and makes Belloq interesting is A, that he can sit down and have a conversation with Indiana Jones and they can converse. But I think the other is after Marion is captured by the Nazis and we think that they're going to torture her, instead he brings her out wine and a new dress, and essentially they have a date, right? He's a very likable person and the two of them really enjoy each other. When she pulls a knife on him to try to escape, they just laugh drunk and he just watches her leave the tent. He's very likable in that way, even though he's doing these abhorrent things, because characters are complex and characters need to be complex, especially in short stories. In short stories, we tend to create shorthand for everything. We make things very simple as much as we can because we're trying to condense things. But if you can infuse one redeeming quality in your villain and you can infuse one deep personal flaw in your hero or your protagonist, you're going to be able to add a layer of realism and something attractive to a reader. So what I want you to do is I want you to come up with a villain or two and write about what their redeeming quality is. And as you think of these things, I think you could think about writing a short story about this horrible person exhibiting that redeeming quality. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about that? I've been muted this entire time, haven't I? Okay.
No, I'm just furiously writing. So.
Okay. Well, we'll take another 5 minutes or so and do that with your villains. And then take a look at the characters that you were working on before and these villains and see what places they could come in conflict and maybe add some flaws to those characters that you've already worked out as well. And then see what story potential that might add to things. Okay. Did you guys come up with anything you're happy with?
A little bit.
A little bit. So, think about your characters this way and think about how they could be put in conflict. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about other ways you can add layers of depth to your characters, and then we'll sort of move on to the next thing. I don't want to spend too much time on characters because we've got other things to get to. But one thing is the contrast in how a person acts that you might be able to use to increase their characterization. These aren't things that you're going to really draw attention to. You're going to let your readers sort of pick up on them, maybe subconsciously. But people have ways of acting differently in different situations. You might act differently in front of your kids as you do your parents. You might act differently in front of your friends than you would in front of your spouse. You might behave differently depending on which friend that you're spending time with. You might also have a contrast in how you approach or treat people. One thing I run into a lot, actually, that I notice as a character trait is that people will suck up and grovel and be as nice as possible to people that they think can help their chosen career, but then treat the person serving them coffee like a total nightmare, right? Those are the contrasts of characters. A character can appear really nice and wonderful and great in one situation and then be a monster in another. So how can we code these sorts of ideas into our writing with our characters without drawing attention to them? How might their thoughts differ from their speech, for instance, right? Like having them think one thing and then say another. You found your internal monologue hoping you could say one thing, but then find yourself saying something polite instead, or vice versa, or what sort of contrasting traits could they have? Do they slouch in front of their friends but straighten their backs in front of authority figures, or things like that? They're not things that you're going to be hanging lanterns on in the story, but if you layer them into your character, people are going to pick up on that, and it's going to add a depth to them. The next thing is secrets, giving your characters secrets, because what it does is it gives them something to be anxious about, and it gives them a story conflict, like immediately. If you just sit down and think about what secret your character might have, how can the pressure of that secret fuel the writing of that character? How can it aid in the dramatic tension of the story? And then what would the story revolve around? I mean, you can come up with story ideas right off the bat by taking one of those characters that we created earlier tonight, figuring out what their secret is, and then just asking yourself, what would be the worst possible situation for them to have to reveal that secret? Like, that right there is a short story. What pressures are there to them to do it? Because people don't reveal secrets unless the consequence of revealing it is less than the consequence of continuing to keep it. Other ways you can add layers to your characters is how you define their physical appearance, and sometimes how that physical appearance is at odds with their description. And one thing I'll say is try to avoid cliches. In stories, don't make all the good people seem to be fit and attractive and all the evil people overweight and ugly. Like, that's not like the way life is or how people really are, and that's really bad writing. Imagine the right character for the part, but don't fall into a stereotype or a cliche. And the next thing is, like, how can you reveal their character by their attire, right? Someone arriving in a business meeting or to a business meeting in a kilt says something different than a character arriving to a business meeting in torn jeans or formal dress or a tuxedo, right? Like, you can use those layers of physical description to really say something about your character with nothing more than just the description. Their names are really important too. How you pick a name says something about the character. It says what era they're from. It can give us information about your character, like what immediate image does the last name Garcia give you as opposed to Smith? What about say O'Connell versus Reynolds, or Mifune versus Rogers, or Lieber versus Callahan? This goes back to a technique that Stephen King talks about a lot, like avoiding the general and opt for the specific. You'll notice he never talks about cars in his books. It's always a sedan, right? Or you never describe like, hey, there's a dog walking down the street. You're going to give a specific sort of dog, right? Because dog is so broad, it can't give the audience a very specific idea of what that should look like. But a German Shepherd versus a Labradoodle gives you two very distinct things. And I think names can do that as well. But you can also turn that around and use a defiance of expectations with names. I mean, like, it's a little bit of a cliche, but Shel Silverstein's the song he wrote, A Boy Named Sue, right? Like, everyone sort of treated this boy named Sue differently because he had the name Sue, and it defied expectations, and he had to work to continue to defy the expectations of his name. Otherwise, he'd keep getting his ass beat. But the name of a character can often be that first window we see into a character. So you need to take the time to choose a name that means something and says something to the audience. The other thing is character voice. How does the voice of your character reveal itself to the audience? A 50-year-old bookworm is going to use bigger words than a 15-year-old skater kid. Word choice matters in how your characters talk and act and how they're described. And you need to figure out what that says about them. Regionalisms could affect your character too. Like, do they refer to it as soda or pop? Or are they from like Georgia and they call everything that's carbonated and sugary Coke? Do they say you guys or y'all or even use guys? Or are they working to make their language more gender neutral and coming up with something that they weren't raised to say? How much do they swear or don't swear? The vulgarity of a character is going to tell you something about them too. But it also adds a potential point of contrast. A supervillain that won't swear in the most naive of ways is going to make a reader wonder why. So those are just ways to layer in a lot of those differences in characters to add complexity to them, and create something good with them. So I want you to take like 5 minutes and see if you can kind of take all of those ideas that we talked about. I'll write them on the screen too. And see if you can add some depth to your characters by doing these. So that's going to be contrasts or contrasting traits. Their secret. So I want you to take 5 minutes or so and think about these things in relation to some of the characters or any of the characters, and maybe the character that's most interesting to you, and see if you can add some of these layers to them and see what else you can come up with, and see specifically what story potential it could have, especially with their secret. What story could you craft out of that specifically? And then how could you illustrate these other things in the course of your story? Any questions about this before we break for that? Okay, we'll get to it. You've got like 5 or 8 minutes. I'm sorry we're going so fast, but there is a lot to cover. Okay. Um, so 2 things before we move on to the next section. One, I want to see, am I moving too quickly? If you have any need for me to slow down or to stop and elaborate on a point, please direct me to do so. I'm here to make sure you soak in as much of this as you can and help you do this writing. And it's just not going to work for anybody if I'm going too fast or you have any problems that you need me to slow down for. We just have a lot we got to cram in. So how many of you kind of went through that with your characters and were able to come up with story ideas that you could start working on now based on the work you've done so far?
I did.
I found one that might be interesting.
So I want you to kind of take maybe one of those story ideas that might be interesting to this point, and let's sit back and think about from what point of view we're going to write it from, because I think that can be one of the most daunting challenges of sitting down to write a short story, is like, whose eyes are we going to tell the story through? Are we getting in as close as we can to the head of another character with like a first person voice? Are we maintaining more objective distance between our narrator and the character with a third person limited point of view? Are you throwing the reader into the thick of it with second person? Are you a god looking down over everything with a third person omniscient look at the world? Whatever decision you make, you're still going to have to understand why you're picking that point of view character. What makes them the best person to tell the story through? How does the story change if we change the point of view? So that's what we're going to be talking about for the foreseeable future. I assume I don't necessarily need to run through the differences between first person, second person, and third person limited and omniscient. Does anybody need a refresher on that, just in case? So one thing I want to show you, so first person and second person are sort of self-explanatory, but there's a technique. Hold on one second. What do you need? Yeah, I'm in a class. I need to teach, okay? I'm going to lock the door next time, okay? Can you not tell them? Excuse me for 1 second.
Does anybody think that their story took a turn that they didn't see coming from doing these exercises, or is that just me?
Definitely.
I gotta ask,
I learned something about a character that I was totally not expecting to know, so that was cool.
Yeah, this is super helpful so far.
you are recording this, aren't you, Tara?
We are, yep.
'Cause
Brian will...
I lost total sound when he started that last section. I had to move places and try to reboot, come back in.
Yeah, we're recording, so we'll post it. For sure.
Okay, so sorry about that. One technique I kind of want to talk to you about in third person limited is something that I think is a little bit that I don't think people pay enough attention to it, but you can get to varying degrees of intimacy with third person limited based on how close you bring the camera, so to speak. So because I'm a film guy, I kind of think of these in terms of like zooming in and zooming out with your wide shot and your medium shot and your close up. So if your wide shot is this, that's third person limited. Your character is there. You're seeing the action. You're seeing them move. Then this might be your medium shot, right? You're a little bit closer in. You can see a little bit more detail, and it takes a little longer for you to take all that detail in. So it's a slightly more detailed shot, and it also slows the pace down just a little bit. The third is going to be the close-up. That's going to be the closest in that you can get in third person limited, because everything has to be through the lens of this character anyway. because it's third person limited. So all of these are through this character's lens, but the wide shot is the furthest away from their lens. The medium shot is the next closest in. And then this last one is a close-up shot where it actually gives you their visceral feelings. And this technique can be used in one of two ways to sort of like, as you're looking in third person limited, the closer into the character you get, the more intimate it seems, the further away, then the more far away or distant the character seems. But it's also for pacing, right? Those wide shots, those really quick shots, like this top one, are going to quicken your pace. Your pace slows down the closer you are to the character, and the further out you zoom, the more you speed the pace up. So that's just a technique. And if anybody has any questions about that, please ask. But this is a technique that I find really powerful in trying to establish what distance I am writing from my third person character, and thinking about it in those terms of sort of like, is this sentence a close-up, or is it a medium shot, or is it a wide shot? And just like cinematography in a movie, you're going to want to vary those based on what it is you're trying to say and what visceral reaction you're trying to convey. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yep.
Oh, go ahead.
I answered your question. Sorry, I wasn't on mute.
So any of the styles of first person, second person, or either third person, limited or omniscient, are totally valid ways of telling a story. And you can usually pick the same character for each of them, but you have to sit down and think about your story and wonder, who's the character that I am choosing to tell the story through? Is it going to be more interesting for the audience to hear that first person through their eyes? Is it going to be more interesting, and are we going to be able to add more mystery by moving out to third person limited? Because you got to think, in first person, the audience will only know what that character tells them. In third person, you can imply things that maybe that person doesn't know or doesn't realize. Or you can switch points of view between people in between sections to add up different bits of information. Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire is really a perfect example of that, where none of the characters really know the overarching story of the book, right? Every section is told from a third person perspective, with just a slice of the story that they know from, and that you as the reader have to assemble all of those, like shuffling a deck of cards together, to understand the overall story, because none of the individual characters do. So you have to really figure out which character is the most interesting, or what group of characters are the most interesting, in order to create the most narrative intrigue for the reader. So as you're trying to pick your character for your story, I've got some questions for you to ask yourself. Which character has the most to lose? Which character has the most interesting reaction to the events that are going to happen? Which character has the most unusual or out of the ordinary inner life? What sort of character have I not seen in this situation before? And what is the anti-stereotype for this situation? I think these are 5 of the key questions for you to ask. These are key questions that I ask before I sit down to write a short story. The short story I'm working on now is something that I'm going to submit to Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine. I'll kind of tell you what it is about it and how I kind of landed on the character, the point of view character. I haven't written it yet, but this is sort of the key questions I've had to answer before I'm able to start writing it. But I really want to push back on the whole, and it's sort of not popular, but it's being talked about in the discourse right now that orcs are sort of always portrayed as evil, and it's sort of like orcs are almost like a shorthand for the sort of racism that we see inherent in our society. Orcs are always bad. Orcs are coded as, depending on what you're reading, they're coded as racist depictions of Black people, or they're coded as racist depictions of Native Americans, the bloody savages, that sort of thing. So I was thinking about trying to turn that on its ear. So the character I haven't seen in that situation would be an orc who is a wandering adventurer looking for jobs to like rescue somebody, right? And so the character who has the most to lose is the person who's sort of in this situation experiencing all of the effects of society that doesn't believe that they can be a hero. Their inner life would have the most interesting reaction because they're fighting this. And I haven't seen them in these situations. And really, like, the idea that I had is them trying to get a job in a tavern, which is a very standard fantasy trope, but no one wants to give them a job because they're an orc. And then at the end of the story, the people that they're rescuing at the bottom of the dungeon don't want to go with them because they don't trust that they're actually a hero because they're an orc. And he's just sort of exasperated by this. And it would be sort of like this mix between dramatic and action-packed, but also a little bit comedic and tongue-in-cheek because it's on some level a satire. And I'll refine that and come up with, make sure I'm trying to not be problematic with it or anything, but it was something that answered a lot of these questions for me, right? Like, how frustrating would that be that because you're an orc, no one wants you to save them, even though they're in dire situations that they need saving. I haven't seen orcs doing that in popular fantasy. I haven't, and that character just sort of has the most to lose in that they are good characters in a world that thinks they're all evil. So that was actually, like, I thought about that and tried to come up with ways to approach it. And it wasn't until really checking off these questions to see how that would work that I decided, okay, not only do I want to tell that story, but I want to tell it from the point of view of the orc so I can get into their inner life. So those are sort of the questions that you have to ask. But another thing is, like, you can take any situation, and in that specifically, like, I thought about, do I tell it from the perspective of the person trying to hire an adventurer to rescue these people? And then I thought, well, no, because naturally the audience is going to need to go on the adventure, and unless this person's hiring muscle to accompany them, that wouldn't necessarily work. And if they accompanied them, then the ending wouldn't work with the people in the dungeon not wanting to get rescued. And then I thought about, like, well, what if it's the people in the dungeon getting rescued and their reaction from their perspective about getting rescued by an orc and then not wanting to actually be rescued? And then I felt that would be distasteful from that perspective because there's so much prejudice in that point of view. And so I thought that the orc was the most natural point of view to choose to try to set out on telling this story, if that makes sense. So, like, you kind of just have to go through the list of characters that are going to naturally inhabit the story and ask, how can I tell a story? How can I tell a story from this perspective, and what perspective I need to tell it from, right? Like, take, for instance, and this is an exercise I really like doing in this class, like a situation where a bear is attacking a family of campers. Which character has the most to lose? It's definitely not the bear. Would one of the parents be have the most to lose since their children are in danger? Would it be one of the children since their lives are most at stake? How could we add details to the characters to see which one might have the most to lose? Like, if the father were like a banker and hated camping, that would make him sort of the antithesis of the situation, and he might have the most to lose and be the least equipped to deal with it. You know, you just have to go through and look at all the different perspectives that you might tell the story from, and then, you know, sort of go through that algorithm to figure out who is the most interesting, who's going to create the most narrative suspense for the reader, what's going to propel the reader through the opening as they ask questions, what promise does that point of view make to the reader about the end of the story. Does that make sense? So if you all want to really think about the story that you want to tell for your anthology story or for whatever, and sort of look at the title and the characters that we've worked on, and think about the story. And I want you to try to come up with, spend some time, the next 5 or 6 minutes or so, and work on identifying who is the point of view character, who's the correct point of view character for your story. Who's going to create the most narrative suspense? Who's going to intrigue the reader the most? Who's going to allow you to have the turns and the reveals in the story that you want to work? And just who has the most to lose? I think that's one of the biggest ones. It's really boring to watch an innocent bystander watch a character with something to lose if we don't know, right? So unless anybody has any questions, take some time and explore that on paper. Okay. How do you feel about that? Did it help you identify an approach vector for the story you're going to write? Okay. We're going to talk about theme now, and theme is definitely a way to approach. It's definitely a way to approach short stories, and it's really, I think, hard to wrap your head around sometimes. I think it's sort of like an esoteric, you know, magic spell that we have to learn to cast as we deepen as writers and mature as writers. Your theme is never going to be written directly into the text of a story. It's meaning that you're going to know, and the entire short story taken completely is your method of communicating that theme. So theme needs to correctly state a problem, but it doesn't need to solve it. It's what your story means, but it's not what it's about, right? So themes aren't questions. They're more often statements. They're not, but they're statements, but they're not something that you're going to see on like a poster, right? They aren't explicit. They're implied. They're the feeling you want to leave a reader with. They're that big idea of the story, and therefore they're bigger than the story. So I'm going to share the screen, and I've got a few that I've written down, and I would like you to shout some out if you want me to add them to the list. You know, and go ahead and shout any of these out. I'm just going to write some like,
Don't rock the jukebox.
Might does not make right.
what I want to talk about specifically is the theme of The Last Jedi, and that's I think The Last Jedi is probably the single most like effective storytelling around theme that I've seen in the last, I don't know, in my lifetime. It's probably the best distillation of how theme can work and how theme can influence every facet of story. And I got to talk to Rian Johnson about it, and about theme specifically. And I want to share this quote that he gave me for this interview. And he said, the first thing is making it clear that theme is not a message. Theme is not a sermon or an adage or anything you can put on an inspirational poster. For me, for theme to really fuel a story, it has to be something that is first off applicable to my own life. So it's alive for me. It's something that I'm actually struggling with. It's not just a nice thing that I believe. It's something that is complicated and has many different facets. Even when you have it as a statement, that means you'll be able to explore it from many different facets with the characters. It's not illustrating a simplistic thing over and over again. It's taking a look at a complicated thing from many different angles and allows you to really use it as fuel for your story. Also, though, and this is just personally, the way that I approach it, I do need something that I would call a theme that's like that, and I do build every single element of the story around it. The goal for me is to have literally everything in the movie be in some way, shape, or form an exploration of the central theme of the story. I think that's where it all starts for me. It's not a simplistic moral statement, it's the opposite. It's a very challenging, complicated moral statement that requires investigating and is going to be pushed and pulled and challenged throughout the course of the story. Now, if you think to The Last Jedi and think about, well, I just think about this one in particular, right? How every character, hero and villain, is exemplified and serves that theme. Whether that's Kylo Ren seeing a vision, like Kylo Ren seeing a vision and it telling him that Rey is going to join him and they're going to defeat Snoke together, as opposed to Rey's version of that vision where he's going to join her and renounce the dark side. Look at how Luke fits into that with the different points of view that we have on Luke's alleged potential betrayal of Ben in those visions as they went through. Poe is challenged with the fact that he doesn't have all the information about the situation. And from his point of view, if he doesn't have the information and he doesn't know the plan, then naturally there isn't one, which is a flaw in his character that he needs to overcome. Finn is challenged in his point of view with whether or not he should be completely about self-preservation or if he should join the resistance. And that's exemplified between Rose's story and DJ sort of acting as the angel and devil on his shoulders. Rose saying you have to believe in something because bad things are going to happen. And DJ saying evil's on both sides are the same, who cares? Don't join and preserve yourself. All of the characters you'll see have those angels and devils over their shoulders that offer them two different perspectives, and they have to find their truth based on those perspectives, depending on their own point of view. The climax of the film is predicated on the notion of point of view. When Luke shows up at Crate to save the resistance, to them, they see a symbol of hope, but to Kylo Ren, he sees a symbol of betrayal and something that he needs to destroy. And when he tries to destroy it, he's so blinded by that hatred, he doesn't realize that even that is an illusion. So his point of view is altered by that. Like just the entire story is filled with these. If you watch it knowing that that's the theme, you'll come to the very real factual understanding that it's the best written Star Wars movie ever made. And so, but the way Rian Johnson approached it as a writer is that he took that theme and pushed it from every single direction he could think of. And that's what we need to do in our stories. We need to take the theme and see how can we approach the theme that isn't trite, that takes on the aspects of people getting it wrong or trying to get it right or trying to do something else, right? Like, money can't buy happiness. If you've got a story about money not buying happiness, clearly your protagonist is going to learn this at some point through the story, but other characters are going to have to exemplify aspects of that for you to explore. Maybe money can buy happiness in certain situations. What does happiness mean? Right? Are there characters that can do that? Are there characters that can do it with some degree of success or failure? And how does that relate to your protagonist? Not everybody is your friend. You can have a protagonist learning that trusting somebody is necessary and they automatically do that. And then somebody else could be approaching that from the same way by saying like, no, not everybody is my friend, but they need to learn to trust somebody. Those two characters could be at odds with each other where one naturally trusts them and the other says, no, you can't trust me. And they have to trust each other and they still need to get over that. Does that make sense? Like how you need to explore theme from different facets? So what you need to do is find out how to put your characters at odds with one another in a way that hooks into the theme. By putting your characters in conflict with one another, you're creating opportunities to explore different aspects of the theme. The actions, the choices, and the conversations that they're going to have over that are going to enable them to explore the theme, allow the reader to explore the theme and really understand it. What I want you to do for the next exercise is take about 5 minutes and think about the theme that you might want to explore with your story, and look at ways you can take the characters you've been working on tonight and put them in conflict with each other based on that theme, where they're both exemplifying different facets of the same thing. And again, you're going to find ways to connect dots on a story that's going to make it more layered, more complex, and more interesting than just being on the surface. Are there any questions about that before we dive into this? That was a lot. It's okay, I don't bite. I mean, much. No, I don't bite. Okay. Well, let's get to it. We'll be back at like 8:55 with that.
You're just giving us plenty to think about. We're all lost in thought about our stories. It's a good sign.
Okay. Well, actually, this one, why don't we go? No, let's not. We're running out of time. There's so much left. Yeah, take 5 minutes and think about your theme and how you can approach it with your characters and put them in conflict with each other. And I'll put this on the on the whiteboard. Okay, like 5 minutes. Okay. Do you feel like that can help you add layers to your story and take it to the next level? There's a very reliable thumbs up from Anna.
Yes, for sure.
So the next two things I want to talk about as we're going through this that relate into themes are symbols and motifs. And I want to say you don't have to sit down and think of the theme for your story before you start to write. That's a strategy that some people use. And like any bit of advice or exercise that I'm giving you tonight, if it works for you, use it. If it doesn't work for you, I'm a charlatan and I'm an imposter anyway, so you shouldn't be listening to me as it is. But as far as motifs and symbolism, they're very pretentious to talk about, it feels like. And they're things that can help your story very specifically, but there's a lot of writers who get really offended when you say like, no, there's no symbolism. This didn't mean anything. It was all an accident. And letting your unconscious create symbols in the story that maybe you're not aware of is totally valid. And readers are allowed to pick those symbols up out of it. And there's no reason to get offended by that. But if you can think about those things in advance and you can weave those into your story, it's going to make your revisions easier, because what you're going to do in your revision is you're going to, sometimes I write stories just because I have the flavor for a story in my mouth and I don't know how to express that. So I write the story and I really don't know what it means. I don't know what the theme is until I get to the end. When I get to the end of that first draft, I say, oh, okay, this is what this means. And I go through and read and try to pick up on things that my unconscious was doing or my subconscious was doing and see if I can bolster or reinforce them in regards to the theme, in regards to symbols, and in regards to motifs. Now, as we talk, so both having them planned out in advance or going through and revising through them so that they work better are two totally different but equally valid ways of going through this. So motifs are recurring images or details that highlight the idea of the story in really subtle and repetitive ways. So my story for the League 85th anniversary anthology, there's a motif in there that I didn't notice until one of my readers caught it on my first draft. And then in subsequent drafts, I made sure to lean into that. But it's about a French rural doctor hiding partisans during the war. And there's a pair of Nazis that are coming to, like, one of the Nazis has cut himself and he's coming to the doctor to sort of get sewn up by the doctor. At the same time, he's got these, you know, these fugitives under the floorboards. And I didn't realize it until a reader pointed out to me that every time the doctor in his internal dialogue refers to the Nazis, he uses animalistic similes and metaphors. He refers to the Nazis in those animalistic terms. And I didn't quite realize that I was doing it, but once the reader pointed it out to me, I made it a motif through the piece, that those are the terms with which he talks about them from that perspective as he's grappling with his Hippocratic oath about, like, do I help them? Are they even people? Are they monsters? Are they animals? And so that's something that really came out in the revision process. In Great Gatsby, one of the recurring motifs to help emphasize the themes of, like, excess and the American dream are the parties, right? The parties that Gatsby throws create this recurring motif of the excess in contrast to the time, in contrast to the period, that sort of pre-depression or depression era excess are those motifs. So I want you to think about those motifs that you could include in your short stories, whether those are very simple internal dialogue things or setting or things like that you're able to use. Now the difference between a symbol and a motif is that a symbol is an object or a character or a setting or anything else that's used to represent something else while supporting the theme. So going back to The Last Jedi, Rey's lightsaber is a symbol that supports the theme, which is why Rey tries to hand it to Luke and Luke rejects it, right? Because Luke has taken on nonviolence because in his point of view, violence is the cause of the problems, and that trying to change the outcomes of things causes them to happen worse, which is the lesson he learned from his father. So he rejects the lightsaber as that symbol of aggression, right? And it's why Rey picks it up. It's why I really love the moment that I didn't even pick up on it until like 10 times watching it, but as Rey is getting overwhelmed with how she can help Kylo Ren, she's standing over Luke in the rain with this symbol of aggression over Luke, the same way Luke is caught standing over Ben in his visions in the flashback sequences. She's doing the exact same thing, and it's illustrating to her how you can hold a lightsaber over somebody and not actually mean to use it, but do it out of fear or out of a reaction. It's the other reason it took me a few viewings to understand why Luke Skywalker shows up on Crate as an illusion with that same lightsaber, because that lightsaber is Excalibur through the Skywalker saga, from Anakin's time with it, Luke's time with it, spending with it as Excalibur in the original trilogy, and Rey finding it again and it calling out to her like the Lady of the Lake in The Force Awakens. And he shows up with it because it means something to the audience as a symbol, with Kylo Ren feeling like that's his birthright. It means something to the audience and how it's broken between Ben and Rey before then. And it means something to Luke, as this was the first lightsaber that he'd encountered, and it ended its tenure with him ended in a very horrific way the moment he found out that Darth Vader was his father. So it's just dripping with all this symbolism, just this one object in the story. So if you can infuse your story with that symbolism, you need to do that. I don't know, how many of you saw Knives Out? The coffee mug at the beginning, at the end, is a really great piece of symbolism that he used to help communicate and tell the story. So how can you take motifs to help support the theme and symbols to represent other things in the story to help support your theme? How can you combine those things together to make your story better, to make it so that there's layers like an onion for the audience to peel away, for the reader to peel away, for you to work on that. So any questions about theme, symbol, or motif?
How do you know where and when would be like the right time to put in the first one and then like consequent entrances?
So that really depends on the story. I think the unfortunate thing about writing is that we learn how to write, but every time we sit down to write a new story, we have to relearn how to write that story. So we just have to take all the craft that we're learning and sit back and ask, what's the most engaging and interesting way to tell this to the reader? And that's the correct answer for this story, for this idea, for these characters. So, the right answer could be you start with the symbolism. Like Knives Out's a perfect example. Like the third shot of the movie is that coffee cup coming down on that tray and then moving up the stairs with the my house, my rules and things and whatnot. And then you find the murdered body. And then as the story progresses over and over and over again, you don't actually see the coffee mug again. And it's not till the last shot when you see the coffee mug, and all of a sudden you're jolted with this, oh, that's what that's saying. That's how this is putting all this together, and you're left with that feeling. Introducing it those two times was exactly the right choice. But with like Rey's lightsaber in The Last Jedi, it had to figure prominently through the whole story, right? At different junctions through the story, at different junctures through the story. So it really just depends on what the symbol is, the power of that symbol. A really great movie that I would recommend everybody watching, it's the second greatest romantic comedy of all time in my view, but I could be wrong, is 1969, The Apartment, written and directed by Billy Wilder. Until, I want to say, Schindler's List, it was the last movie in black and white to win a Best Picture Oscar. It's basically I'm not going to get into the story, but there is an element of the story where there's a woman in the story who has this broken compact mirror, and we see that it's broken, and it's symbolic right off the bat, and that's how she views herself, is cracked through a mirror. Like her reflection of her interior life is that she's cracked and broken. And they pay so much attention to it and that symbolism that they could have left it there and it would have been really great. But she loses the mirror at some point, and she's sort of having an affair with her boss or some other person above her, and Jack Lemmon's character is in love with her, and he knows that she's got some lover that she's trying to run away from, or something's going on, but he doesn't know who it is. And it's also his boss. And so there's a great scene where he finds the compact mirror in his boss's office, and he opens it and realizes it's hers. And it gives the audience the information, in addition to the symbolism of it being the mirror and this cracked reflection of her, that we know what he knows now. We know that he knows all of these things about the story that he didn't know before, without them saying another word in dialogue or explaining anything else in the story. So that's sort of, when I talked to Rian Johnson, we both sort of nerded out about this specific moment in The Apartment, and he said, and rightly so, like, that's the gold you're digging for in the hills, is when you're able to assign an object that might just ordinarily be inanimate, both meaningful symbolism and create a motif out of it. And it works as ammunition to help the story. And I think that's something that we can do in our short stories pretty effectively. Any other questions before we move on to the shapes and structures of short stories? This is a lot. Like I said, like we're condensing a 6-week course into 2.5 hours. Okay. So Ernest Hemingway said that prose is architecture, it's not interior design. It's that structure, it's that outlining things, it's putting things together that we're really looking for, right? So as far as the differences between a short story and a novel, short stories are going to be more contained moments, and novels are strings of those moments put together, right? What you need to do is just think of it as those small slices. You can look at any overarching story. You could look at any story in a novel and see if you could slice that out and make a short story out of it, right? Like, that's totally valid, right? Like, you can do any of that. So because short stories are often predicated on that single moment, that one bit of revelation, that one character growth that makes the audience go like, huh, that's what you're looking for, right? You're going to look for that moment to structure everything around giving the audience that reaction. Aristotle observed that that stories, all stories, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard said that yes, every story needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but they don't necessarily need to happen in that order. Short stories can play with that. And short stories, the advice you're always given, and it's sound advice, is always start as close to the end as possible. So what you're looking for is a moment that's going to leave your audience going, huh. Think about that, like Twilight Zone ending. Think about Black Mirror. Think about Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Think about how they construct a story to bring you to that huh moment. Because what you're doing is really everything in your short story is building up to that parting shot. So what I want you to do is I want you to take about 5 minutes, and I want you to think about and really identify what the parting shot of your short story is going to be. What's that feeling you want the audience to feel? Because once you understand what that intended ending is, you're going to have a much better idea of how to assemble everything you need to get the audience to feel that parting shot that way. So what is the feeling you're trying to evoke by the end? What are the 3 steps your story has to take in order to bring the audience there? I'll write those down. I'll write those down on the whiteboard. Does that make sense? What's that feeling you want to leave the audience with, and what are the 3 steps necessary to bring them there? That beginning, that middle, and that end. And we'll take about 5 minutes for that. as you're thinking about that, can you see where knowing what the ending, what the last feeling you want to leave your audience with is going to help you figure out how to construct the architecture of bringing them there? Thank you for the thumbs up, Anna.
That was by far the best exercise for finding an ending based on a feeling that I've ever had explained. So that was awesome.
So what you need to do is kind of think about how to structure your story around that. What is it that you want your audience to feel at the end? Other stories, and you can mix and match these. They have what I call a story revolving around the decisive action. So a lot of short stories are going to feature a character that has to make a specific choice. In a novel, a character is going to be faced with all kinds of choices, from the inciting incident to the turn in the act 1 turn, the act 2 turn, the climax. They're going to be making choices through their entire series of try-fail cycles through the second act. But in a short story, often you get the character to make one choice, and it's the most decisive choice. So how do you portray that choice and give it the gravitas that it needs to matter, with making it the only real decision in the piece? Other stories might include decisive actions of the moment, but the parting shot is one of inertia. These are called like circular stories. A character is going to end at the same place they begin, and often that's boring. I'd usually counsel people against it, but it can work really well. Maybe the best example is the short story, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. He's in a fantasy world. He's urged to come away from it. The decisive choice that he makes is that he agrees to come out of that fantasy world. But as the story ends, after he's convinced everyone he can come out of it, he's right back in it again, right? So it creates this circular pattern, but it has a beginning, a middle, an end, and stakes along the way. It's instructive how you can split off just a piece of the hero's journey and tell a story about it too. If we imagine the life of Walter Mitty as a larger hero's journey, this would just be one of those try-fail cycles. He might succeed later in life, but he's not ready to do that now, right? Like, you could write a short story. I think one of my favorite try-fail cycles that everybody forgets is in The Lord of the Rings, because they excised it from the movie because it would be hilariously boring, is that in the book, Frodo gets the mission to take the ring to Mount Doom or to Rivendell or wherever, but he's got to do it carefully, and he ends up spending like 30 years on the other end of the Shire just partying with his buddies while they wait for the right moment to go. And so like you could totally create a short story out of Frodo going like, should we go now? No, let's just forget about it. We'll leave it in the trunk. I'm glad the movie shortened up that timeline, but in the movie or in the books, it was not like that at all. And Frodo wasn't ready to accept his hero's journey to its full degree at that point. And so you could do stories about that. Another really common way to write a short story is linear narration. You start at the beginning, you state the dilemma, and then you show a linear progression of events until the ending. Time doesn't often skip forward a lot. It never skips back in this style of story. There's a short story I'd recommend you all read. Graham Greene wrote it. It's called The Blue Film. And it's told in this manner, and it proceeds in that manner. The characters are in a situation in media res, and the story proceeds from there. For those of you, I don't know, do you want me to spoil the story, or is anybody actually going to read it, or should I just explain it really quickly?
Just explain it.
Okay, so The Blue Film is about this sort of businessman who has brought his wife on a business trip to an Asian country it's Bangkok or something. And she's just sort of like, I really want you to take me to see the sights. And he's taking her to see the sights, but she's like, no, when you're out here by yourself, you're going to much seedier places than you'd be taking me. And she's sort of daring him to do something really untoward or take her to somewhere seedy. And he's like, fine. And he bribes he bribes a, like, well, he doesn't bribe, but it's sort of like, you know, the kid in the taxi or whatever. He says, you know, take us to one of the places that shows those sorts of films. And he takes her to what is essentially sort of this backroom porno theater. And she's like, not really taken with it. She's more taken with the adventure that they're going to this backroom porno theater or whatever. And the film starts, and he starts to recognize that it's him in the film as a very young man before he met his wife. And she starts to realize that it's him, younger than she'd ever known him. And she gets very upset about this, like very upset. And she's trying to figure out when in his life he would have done this and why he'd never mentioned it before. And he kind of tells her this story about how it was this girl, it was when he was in college, and it was this girl he loved dearly, and she needed the money, and she asked him to do it with her because she wanted somebody that she could trust and actually feel a connection with when they were doing this, making this stag film, this blue film. And she just sort of berates him, and then they kind of have like really angry makeup sex. And the parting shot of the short story is him sort of turning over and feeling for the first time in his marriage that he's actually betrayed the only person he's ever really loved. And it's such he packs all of that into like 1,500 words. And it starts in a linear progression from her in the hotel going, take me somewhere better, all the way up to that moment with very few skips in time and a very linear progression from that moment to the end. It's the very epitome of start as late as possible, start as close to the end as possible, and get out quickly. Then some other forms would be using flashbacks and stream of consciousness. They're stories told from your narrator in the future. So if you remember, Stand By Me started as a Stephen King short story, and the book is entirely written from the point of view of Gordy as he looks back on the events of his childhood as a writer, as an adult, right? So it allows a looseness to the narrative that lets you go backwards and forward in time to create a stream of consciousness feel, because details can pop out of nowhere since it's from a hindsight perspective. And these quirks can be chalked up, these quirks in the narrative can be chalked up to the characterization of the character's memory. So it's very pure stream of consciousness. Actual pure stream of consciousness would be short stories like you might see from James Joyce or William Faulkner that just meander based on the perspective of the writer and the character. Ernest Hemingway wrote a really hilarious satire of that style of writing, that pure stream of consciousness, called The Torrents of Spring. That was really funny. Frame stories are stories that might have a similar frame and all add up to that. So think like the Canterbury Tales or Arabian Nights. So they're small stories told in the context of a larger story that hopefully adds to a larger point. One of my favorites is in Don Quixote, which is a favorite book of mine. There's 2 chapters in part 1, I think it's chapter 31 and 32, called The Tale of Ill-Advised Curiosity. And Don Quixote and Sancho have gone to this bar, and they're in this tavern, and they're hearing stories, and this is the story that's told at the tavern. And the story has a broader moral point that can be applied later in the story of Don Quixote, even though it feels like a short story in the context of that. And that would be a frame story in that regard as well. The Arabian Nights was a woman putting off her death and sort of asking for all these stories. So it's just a different story every night, the 1001 Nights, things like that. So those are also valid ways of setting up a story. And it seems like we've run out of time for me to talk about pacing. Well, I'll go through pacing really fast. So pacing is how you're going to control how fast it takes an event to unfold. Your character is going to your character going to the store could be handled in half a line of dialogue, or the entire story could be about the trials of getting to the store. The problem is that every event in a story can add this level of focus to it. It's in deciding what needs that level of detail and what doesn't that allows you to set your pacing in the most broad terms. So there's other techniques to pacing as well. We talked about it a little earlier, like varying your sentence length or varying the close-up or the wide shots of your prose is as far as third-person limited. Varying your sentence length is going to make time pass for the audience in a way that feels normal for them. Making all of your sentences on the long side is going to slow your pace. Shortening the sentences and paragraphs is going to quicken the pace. You'll often see really tense moments in short stories and novels add up in that very choppy prose, and the more lackadaisical moments of reflection are going to be very long, flowery prose. And those are the sorts of the ways you expand and contract your pacing as you're working on your short story. And usually the exercise I kind of give people to think about that, think about the last story you wrote, think of an event inside of it, and write down a one-sentence explanation of that event or action. Then do that same action in a paragraph, then expand it into a page, and then see if you could expand that whole thing into a 1,500 word flash fiction, revealing with all the observations that would necessitate the length and revealing the character the whole way through. But yeah, so that's we skipped all of the editing, revision, and publication aspects of short story writing, but hopefully this gave you an overview to help you do some stuff. And I don't know, is there anybody who's walking away from this without an idea for a story to write for their anthology? Is there anyone brave enough to admit that they're walking away without an idea?
The idea I have isn't for the anthology, it's for something else I'm working on, but I do have several ideas.
Okay, excellent. Is there any
I walk
discussion?
away with more than one idea for stories. So
Is that 3 stories? Is there anything anybody wants to talk about? I've got time. I don't necessarily have to race away right this second. If we want to take 5 or 10 minutes, I can answer any questions you've got, and we can kind of close it up that way if you'd like. But you'd have to ask questions for me to answer them.
So I have a selfish answer. You said that
I asked
this
for questions.
this is a condensed version of something that people could go and have access to. How?
So the U of U's continuing education program has me do this. I'm in the middle of teaching it now. Joanne's actually in the class right now. And it's a 6-week course, and we do 3 hours a week for 6 weeks. And I'm teaching it again in the fall. Although that's not listed yet, I am teaching it in the fall. So
cool.
Listings, I think, go up on Monday for that.
Oh, yeah, that is very likely.
I got an email to that effect. So
I would like that, because I've got 3 classes. I'm teaching one on screenwriting, and I'm teaching one on the cinema behind Star Wars. And I'm doing a writing boot camp for pre-writing, or I'm doing a novel writing boot camp for them as well. So
For the continuing education course in the fall, is there any way that information could be posted to the Facebook group so we can see it when it comes up?
yeah, I'll post it to the I can post it to the Monkeys group. I'm in the Monkeys group.
Okay, thanks.
Any actual questions though, Tara?
that's too high a bar, Brian. Why do you want us asking questions?
Because that's like, isn't that like part of the Socratic method? Like,
Oh.
I would love to. It's also not a question, but more of
Gosh
a.
darn it, Tara.
I wonder how, for me, theme is the hardest to describe, and also the most compelling reason to read short stories. And so maybe give us last parting words on how to really solidify that if you are still struggling with that concept.
How to solidify a theme?
Yes.
I think, I really think sort of the Ryan Johnson method there is the way to do it, where you come up with an idea that you're grappling with personally. And you'll notice over the course of your writing, you're going to pick, like, you're going to end up with like 5 similar themes that you're going to explore from different angles over the course of your career, mostly, right? Like Alex is going to write about enemies to lovers and like constantly.
Yep.
That's just their natural setting. And they're going to come up with themes that are going to help them explore that. So really it is finding a question that you're grappling with or a question that you're interested in, and then look at it from so many different angles that you can see where the conflict points could be for them. Like I said, I think watching The Last Jedi and maybe even checking out that link where I kind of break it down for all of the characters, like even down to the beginning where Rose is like, Finn is her hero, and then she has to slowly realize that he's not actually inspecting that escape pod, he's trying to escape. And sort of that disillusion of her point of view. Her point of view of him was that he was a hero, and then all of a sudden he's a coward. You know, watching The Last Jedi and seeing how every single character grapples with how things are from their perspective and their understanding of a situation is going to help, I think, as you grapple with that with your characters and your stories. But I think a lot of people confuse theme for those trite sort of morals at the end, right? Like, we're not telling Aesop's fables. We're not telling Grimm's fairy tales. We're trying to tell a story that has a complexity to it that doesn't answer the questions. I think that's the other thing too. You don't need to be definitive about what the theme is. The theme is what the story's about, not the story. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that was helpful.
I had a great moment in my last Salt City Scribes meeting where I had 2 characters who took sort of opposite stances about literature. And by the end of it, the feedback I got was readers were saying, I feel kind of personally attacked about my reading choices, but also like I agree with these characters and the different things they presented. And I can't really tell which one was your opinion. And I was like, that's what we're going for.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly it. That's exactly it.
I mean, there are some cases where it's like Nazis are bad, and that's pretty absolute.
Yeah.
You know, there's instances like that, but there are also a lot of times like in my thesis for my English degree, I finally had a lot of help when we talked about major dramatic question, like what question are you trying to answer, and that's sort of the purpose of the story is to meditate on that question, which is really just theme, like what's the theme, and then you don't really answer it, but you do kind of try to get to a point and then push past at the end to where it's open-ended.
Yeah, exactly that. Like, you're asking yourself a question you have no intention of answering. You have every intention of exploring it from as many different angles as your short story or your novel will allow. And it's not too pretentious to talk about it. I mean, like, we might sound pretentious, but we're not actually being. We're learning.
I did see online once, though, this fun conversation where between animators where they were talking about sometimes you viewers are looking into things a little too hard. Like, there was a scene where there was this chair with only 3 legs, and somebody had written in to say, is this because the character's feeling unstable at this time? And they're like, no, I just forgot to draw the other leg.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the thing. Like, did they forget to do that, or was that a subconscious thing that they weren't aware of? And symbolism is valid when we find it, even if it wasn't the intention of the writer, because reading is a 2-way dialogue. It's a dialogue between the writer and the reader. And so if the reader finds that symbolism, then that symbolism is valid, even if it was a mistake.
So am I correct in hearing that you're saying that sometimes we could have a theme, but we don't necessarily have to answer that theme at the end? Just the concept of what these questions are bringing to the characters is enough to get the reader to think?
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say try not to come up with a definitive answer, because otherwise your ending might come off as preachy, right? But if you can, like, thinking about the ending of The Last Jedi, the concept isn't that moral, right? It's not a moral imperative. It's not a moral statement. It's that people inherently see truth based on their own point of view, for better or for worse. And so every character through that movie struggles with what their truth is and what the truth is to them, good and bad, based on the lens of their experience. And so there's no answer to that, but it's explored from so many different ways that people convince themselves of so many different things based on how they view truth. Seriously, we could have spent 3 hours just dissecting everything we can learn about writing from The Last Jedi.
I agree.
Isn't that what your class is about, Brian, that you're giving in the fall?
That's just built-in promo right there.
It is really helpful, though, to have something that is so widely available to compare to, because then it helps to really illustrate it in a way that it clicks. For me, it does.
That's kind of why I try to tend to lean on movies rather than books for examples, because more people have seen the movies I've seen than have read the books I've read, just generally, because books take so much longer. And I mean, The Last Jedi was something like the 4th highest grossing film of all time. So I'm guessing in a class of 20, at least 15 people have seen it.
And it's easy to be like, hey, do this as homework. It'll take you 2.5 hours. Yeah.
Any other questions from anybody? Well, thank you all for having me then. Hopefully this was what you needed. We're gonna wrap all this up on behalf of Tara while she's taking a phone call.
I was taking a phone call. You weren't supposed to see that.
So yeah, thanks for having me.
This was amazing, Brian. Thank you so much. I know several other people on the chat said that as they were dropping off, this is great. So